Well, welcome back to our final lecture of the Land Center Lecture Series. I appreciate you being here this morning. This topic for today is perhaps one of the more controversial topics, especially as it grows within the context of the church. And so you may not think about cohabitation in the church, but if you start talking to the people in your congregations and talking to people especially, what I find most interesting about this is the number of senior adults and rates of cohabitation, which is rising substantially. And so I'm assuming you'll probably have a little bit to say about, or we can maybe get to it in the Q&A. Yeah. But anyway, so just a reminder, by way of introduction, this is Dr. Brad Wilcox, professor of sociology and director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. I can say this: yesterday, as I was working on a paper that a journal article that I was working on, I was doing some research, and his name popped up again in a book that I was reading, and so it was Mary Eberstadt's Adam and Eve After the Pill. That his research was cited in as well. So Dr. Wilcox is well known around the country and around the world on these issues. And let me pray for us and we'll get started. Father, we thank you for the opportunity to enjoy these lectures over the last couple of days. Father, we pray for Dr. Wilcox as he speaks today and even as he travels home later this afternoon. Lord, may we learn from him and learn how to apply what he has to say within our ministries. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you. Thank you, Evan, for that. So I want to begin my talk this morning by giving all praise, honor, and glory to the ACLU. Because I'd not be standing before you today on this topic were it not for the ACLU. For you see, I got a call in the spring of 2009 from the Arkansas Attorney General's office indicating that the ACLU was challenging Act 1, which at that point in time prohibited cohabiting couples from adopting or fostering children. So at that point, the ACLU brought suit arguing that Act 1 was an unconstitutional infringement of cohabiting adults' rights to equal protection and due process. And in the kind of debate that ensued about this particular piece of legislation in Arkansas, there was a big debate about whether or not this act was in the best interest of children. And so this morning, today, I want to think about both whether or not cohabitation is in the best interest of children, but of course also whether or not it's in the best interests of adults. So these are kind of the two big questions I'm thinking about with you this morning. And of course, I think they're both topical for us today for reasons that'll become more clear in a second. But first, when it comes to adults on this question, what we've seen in the last half century is a dramatic increase in cohabitation, some numbers up here. And I think what's probably most important in terms of the numbers is to kind of understand that about 2/3 of marriages, actually probably now more than that, are preceded by cohabitation. And then when it comes to kids, about 4 in 10 kids will experience a cohabiting union. Either they're going to be born into a cohabiting union, or after their parents get divorced, they'll often spend some time when mom is cohabiting or dad is cohabiting in a new relationship. And what's I think particularly interesting here when it comes to kids is that today, because actually divorce has become less common, today kids are more likely to experience cohabitation than they are to experience the divorce of their own parents. So there's a kind of a mixed story there, but we're focusing again right now on cohabitation. And as we think about why it is more common in our society today as compared to 50 years ago, there are obviously a number of cultural and social points that we can make. We could talk about the sexual revolution, sort of separating the links between sex and marriage. We could think about how expressive individualism has given people sort of the sense that they should sort of do what feels good and be less concerned about kind of social conventions, including ones related to marriage. We could talk about secularization, obviously, the way in which not only people are less likely to affiliate or attend churches today, but they're also less likely to grant religious traditions some kind of moral authority in making decisions about things related to sex and relationships and marriage. And then also we can think too about other factors that make cohabitation more appealing. We can think about how the divorce revolution has kind of made a lot of people understandably gun shy about marriage, and they see cohabitation as a way to kind of, test waters. We'll come back to that point in a few minutes. We could think about how, for men who don't have college degrees, they've seen more instability in their work and declines in their real wages. And so they feel like they're really not ready to go ahead and get married, and they cohabit instead. And then we could also sort of, I think, see how for a lot of 20-somethings, there's this idea today that you have to get all your ducks in a row before you get married. And so people are kind of cohabiting in their 20s rather than getting married because they feel like they're not established professionally, financially, or otherwise. And so they see cohabitation as a sort of a nice alternative to marriage as they kind of get ready to go ahead and become more established and then to marry. But as we kind of think about how these sort of larger cultural and economic and social forces are playing out, it's helpful for us to think kind of in more concrete and in more proximate ways in terms of how younger adults specifically think about cohabitation today, why they think it's sort of an attractive and appealing approach to relationships. So one thing that you see, and this is particularly true for more working class and poor couples, is that issues of kind of convenience and money play a role. So we have here one black female saying, you feel like you don't want to be without that person. You want to spend every moment you know. So it's kind of convenient to be with your dating partner by cohabiting. Or people are concerned about saving money on the rent or on the bills. And this white female says, why did I move in with Peter as opposed to getting my own place right away? Money. Okay, so financial concerns motivated her decision to go ahead and live together. But there are some gender differences that you see when it comes to how women and men are approaching and are attracted to cohabitation. Women are more likely to talk about love when it comes to why they're cohabiting. So this Latina female said, you think you're never going to be in love like that again. And like in this crazy way, this relationship is it. And it makes it an easy issue. Men, by contrast, are more likely to talk about sex in terms of cohabitation. So this Latino male at the bottom of the screen says, I think in the back of a lot of people's heads, we're actually doing it to have easier access to sex and be with one another as much as we want. Okay. And then also for folks who are thinking about this as an opportunity to kind of test the waters for marriage, it does focus it does function in some ways as a kind of courtship. You want to sort of figure out if this person has the kinds of traits, the kinds of virtues and vices that would make for a decent spouse. So this Latina female says this, do you think that someday you will marry him? Well, yes. Okay, then live with him and see how you share the relationship and the routine with him. If you live with him and you're happy with the person, then you can move to another step. And again, in terms of what's different about how women and men are approaching cohabitation, it's important to recognize that commitment is less likely to be a central part of cohabitation for men compared to women. In fact, this slide here, I'll just jump ahead for a second, shows you basically that the percent of folks who are not completely committed is higher in cohabiting relationships in general compared to married ones right here. and is particularly high, as you can see, for cohabiting men as compared to cohabiting women. So this was articulated in this way. By this black male, for instance, at the top of the screen here. I think you'd rather just live with that person and see how they are before you really commit to them, okay? It's kind of a striking articulation of this idea that someone is moving in with someone and is clearly not committed to them. And this is really just an opportunity to sort of figure out if maybe you should become committed to that person. So it's in some ways a very kind of thin relationship, not a real deep connection there in this particular case. And then the final point here is, again, as people are sort of thinking about their own families and their own friends and what's kind of come before in their world and in their social network, a lot of younger adults today have seen divorce. They've witnessed it firsthand. And they're understandably a little bit concerned about jumping into marriage. And so again, cohabitation seems like a pretty good strategy for people who are worried about divorce and thinking that they really need to be really sure before they go ahead and tie the knot. So this Latino male says this: you grow up and people start saying, well, my parents are divorced, and my uncle is divorced, and my grandparents are too. So, why do we have to get married? Why don't we just try it first and see if we are meant to be with each other for the long run? So again, these are some motivations that are guiding young adults towards living together rather than getting married. But you can see in a couple of these motivations too, over the last few slides, that there are plenty of folks who are cohabiting who would still like to get married and who still kind of see this approach as a way to prepare for marriage, test the waters for marriage, figure out if someone might be a good spouse down the road. And when I cover this issue in my sociology of family class at the University of Virginia, I use clickers, which are these in-class polling devices with my students to kind of get them to articulate their views anonymously in class. And I offer this question to them, in my cohabitation lecture, obviously with a certain sense of humor. And the question is this: would you like to try a relationship strategy that's associated with less marital happiness, more conflict, more infidelity, and more divorce? Okay. Of course, no one is saying yes to that. But what most of my students don't know, is that cohabitation, of course, is that strategy that's linked to more divorce, to less marital quality, more conflict, and some other negative outcomes. So again, they don't necessarily understand that or know that. Now, what's important, though, to also acknowledge here is that sort of the research and the literature around cohabitation as it relates to adults is quite contested, okay? And so there are some scholars who would argue that, look, there was a period in time when cohabitation really was kind of an exceptional strategy, and the kinds of people who cohabited prior to marriage didn't have the traits that would lead to stronger and more stable marriages. And that once we kind of control for those kinds of factors, the causal effect of cohabitation on marriage kind of disappears. It's what we call kind of a selection effect, or a selection kind of argument. So again, the idea here is that correlation doesn't always equal causation, and that it might be that there are certain kinds of people who are cohabiting who are themselves more likely to get divorced or to have marital difficulties. And so we know that particularly early on, cohabitation was more common among working class and poor Americans, among obviously less religious Americans, among Americans who had less commitment to one another and to marriage, and for Americans who'd come from non-intact homes. So again, one issue that may be sort of playing out in all this is that cohabitation doesn't necessarily cause marital dysfunction. It merely is sort of an indicator that people are kind of affected by other things that lead to lower levels of marital quality and marital stability. But a number of other studies do find that cohabitation is linked to worse outcomes, even controlling for factors like education, race, and religiosity. And where I think the research is probably strongest is that we seem to be still finding that people who are cohabiting prior to a public engagement are more likely to face lower marital quality later on if they go ahead and get married, and to face a higher risk of divorce. And this is based on the work of Scott Stanley and Galena Rhodes at the University of Denver, this point here. And their basic argument is that, people who are kind of moving in together, absent a formal public commitment to one another, sort of that's reinforced by family and friends, are the ones who are most vulnerable to suffering from some kind of negative outcome when it comes to cohabitation today. Now, in terms of thinking about why cohabitation might, in and of itself, have a negative causal impact on adults' future relationships, I think it's helpful for us to see this little video that is playfully depicting cohabitation.
Well, Chad and Jamie, you've chosen the vows of cohabitation. So Chad, if you would do the honor of looking into your partner's eyes, and with every bit of truth that you can muster up, would you repeat after me? I, Chad, take you, Jamie, to be my cohabitant, to have sex with you, and to hold you responsible for half the bills, to love, and to take advantage of you. From this day forward. Or for as long as our arrangement works out. I will be. More or less faithful to you. As long as my needs are met. And if nothing better comes along. If we should break up. It does not mean this wasn't special to me. Because I love you. Almost as much as I love myself. I commit to live with you. For as long as it works out. So help me, me. In the name of sex. Options. And selfishness. Amen. Well, Chad and Jamie, I want to be the first to congratulate you both. You are now.
So you can see how this humorous depiction of cohabitation vows. You can see how cohabitation is not the same thing as marriage. People think about it obviously often in terms of preparing for marriage, but because it's not the same thing as marriage, the argument is probably not a very good preparation. There are obviously no vows. There's no music, kind of in the air as you walk down that apartment corridor for the first overnight, whatever else it might be. In fact, a lot of people don't even agree on the date at which they started living together. So there's not even there's kind of not a consensus among the couple themselves about when their cohabiting relationship began. And obviously doesn't have the same kind of social and cultural and legal meaning for marriage as it is. So for these reasons in part, cohabitation, again, may not really be the same thing as marriage, may not be a good preparation for marriage. Now, more particularly, I think there are a couple of things that we could reflect on that would suggest why cohabitation into marriage. So on that first point, when it comes to commitment, what I think the concern here is that it might foster a more consumeristic approach to relationships, and this is kind of articulated, I think, particularly well by, this middle quote from a Latina female, where you're kind of like, is this person kind of meeting the bar? And if you live with them and you're happy with them, then you can move to the next step. Well, I think the concern here is that if you're kind of adopting a more consumeristic approach to your relationship and extending that to a co-residential relationship, you may carry that mindset, into the marriage itself. And so, when you've been married, 2 years or 3 years, whatever else, and you're not happy with the way in which your spouse is doing X, Y, or Z, you may be thinking about the exit option. A second point is that because the fact that cohabitation is really not institutionalized, it's not linked to sort of a common set of norms and expectations, what you often get is one partner is thinking about marriage and the other partner is thinking about saving rent and enjoying the goods that are associated with living together. And one older study, we haven't seen something newer on this, but one older study found again that when you looked at motivations, about half were thinking about this in terms of marriage, about a quarter were thinking about it in terms of some opportunistic reason, and about a quarter were thinking about it as an alternative to marriage. But the point here is that there'd be a lot of folks in this mix where one person is thinking about marriage and one person's thinking about either it as an alternative to marriage or as a convenient sort of temporary option. And that can lead, of course, to confusion and conflict in that relationship. And then if that relationship breaks up, it can lead to kind of a disillusionment to some extent with love in general, perhaps, and marriage in particular. Becoming a little more jaded about men and women, relationships, and marriage. And if you carry that sense of being a bit more jaded into your marriage, probably it's not a good thing. Another point is sort of the way in which cohabitation is linked to kind of a more individualistic or autonomous orientation. And one concrete manifestation of this, which was actually mentioned in that mock cohabitation vow or vows, is that most cohabiting couples maintain separate checking accounts, keep their finances separate, which is, of course, understandable, given the lack of a fundamental joint commitment between the two of them. The problem, though, is that if you kind of sort of build that as sort of the foundation of your co-residential relationship, you often will carry that then into your marriage. And I actually experienced this when I was studying at Princeton, and I had a colleague in the sociology graduate program, and she had cohabited with her husband, and then they moved to marriage, and they'd sort of set up from the beginning separate checking accounts. And she was telling me one day that she wanted to buy a couch for their apartment, but she couldn't afford it. And I'm thinking to myself, your husband's a lawyer. You can afford that couch. But it was all about well, this is my money and that's his money, and I can't use his money to buy a couch for our apartment. I was just kind of flabbergasted. I mean, I'd be shown the door by my wife if I kind of had that, mentality about, my money and her money. So it was just kind of an example of the way in which they'd started off on this sort of individualistic track when it came to, among other things, their money. And they sort of carried that mindset into their marriage in ways that actually aren't particularly, helpful for a good marriage, because good marriages are built really on mutual dependence and on sharing basically everything. Another point is about kind of serial relationships. What we're seeing today is that people are moving in and out of cohabiting relationships and out of relationships more generally, and that's in turn linked to oftentimes also more infidelity in cohabiting relationships compared to married ones. And so, again, the fact that people have options today to to move in and out of a series of cohabiting relationships can, I think, put some people at risk for both less marital quality based on the research and for more divorce. Here's some evidence on the divorce front. And in general, we think about the more experience you have with something like teaching, for instance, or playing tennis or football, the better you are at that craft or at that athletic endeavor. But it looks like, based upon some research done by Galena Rhodes and Scott Stanley, that when it comes to our intimate relationships, the more experience you have prior to the wedding day, the worse you do. And that may be because the experience of having lots of relationships may give us emotional baggage, where again, we're kind of a bit more cynical about our relationships and about maybe our spouse once we get married. It may also, according to Galena Rhodes, make people more likely to compare their spouse to previous boyfriends and girlfriends, including previous cohabiting boyfriends and girlfriends. So you might say, well, I'm married to John, and he's a pretty good guy, but he's not as handsome as David was. He's not as funny as Adam was. He's not as hardworking and ambitious as Ralph was. And so again, kind of it may lead people to kind of make comparisons, between their current spouse and previous partners that are not helpful to their marriage. And the final point here is just about kind of this idea that we are creatures of habit. And if you've been in a co-residential relationship with someone, and then you've broken up with that person, left that relationship, and done that again, you're probably more likely to, when you hit that rough spot, that difficult point in your marriage, to think about, again, exiting that relationship like you did in a previous cohabiting relationship. So again, what I'm suggesting here is that the rise of cohabitation has kind of given people access to a lower commitment co-residential option that in and of itself is less stable and can build patterns that then affect people in negative ways down the road when they go on and get married. And the final point in terms of potential causal mechanisms here is what Scott Stanley calls sliding, not deciding. And Stanley's point here is that one of the potential problems with cohabitation is it allows people to kind of slide into a relationship that then slides into eventually marriage. And where people have never had kind of difficult conversations about their dreams for the future, maybe their own faith, their expectations for work and family, their thoughts about where they want to live, their thoughts about a profession, their thoughts about in-laws, their thoughts about friends. And so, you move in together, you buy a pet together, you buy a couch, a TV, sometimes you buy a condo now together. And before you know it, kind of you yourself and your friends and your family members are kind of expecting you to kind of just, move on to marriage. And yet you've never really kind of had those difficult and serious conversations that ideally one should have before one gets married. And you don't lock in a high level of joint commitment also before you get married. And it's these kinds of relationships that are particularly vulnerable for both more conflict, less marital quality, and more divorce. And both Scott Stanley and Galena Rhodes at Denver and my colleague at UVA, Meg Jay, have talked to a lot of younger adults who've kind of fallen into a situation where they kind of move in, they weren't that committed, it was just kind of convenient, kind of live together for a while, and then they just think, oh, we should just probably go ahead and get married. And then they get married and things just, go south. And Meg Jay wrote about this whole idea too for the New York Times if you wanted to look up her work on this idea of sliding, not deciding, and how it's often linked to cohabitation because it is a lower commitment option. So the idea here is that when it comes to the effect that cohabitation may have in a negative way on marriage, it's probably most likely to be expressed or found for younger adults who are having multiple cohabitations prior to marriage, and for young adults who are cohabiting prior to an engagement, who are more likely to be kind of sliding into a relationship rather than kind of deciding to move jointly in a more serious direction as a couple. Okay, so I've talked about cohabitation in adults, and now we're going to talk about cohabitation and kids. Again, I want to be very clear and honest here, because if you're dealing with this issue in some kind of meaningful way, with other young adults, you're going to have people getting on Google, and they're going to be kind of looking up studies and research. And there's a serious kind of scholarly debate about whether or not cohabitation affects marriage in a negative way for adults. And what I'm suggesting to you is that the sort of most powerful social science indicates that risk is most powerful, is most sort of credible to scholars across, the ideological spectrum when there's multiple cohabitations and when there is a cohabitation before an engagement. There's less consensus about cohabitation in other contexts. But I think when it comes to looking at cohabitation in children and kids, there's less reason for debate on this score. And again, this is an issue because more and more kids are spending time in cohabiting households, and about 21% of kids are born today to cohabiting couples. And what we see is that even though you have two adults in the household, kids in cohabiting households do, much like kids in single-parent households. They have high rates of substance abuse, school failure, and psychological problems, as these kinds of studies indicate here on the slide. So there's more likely to be smoking pot, they're more likely to drop out of high school, and they're more likely to be suffering emotional problems here, in this case in adolescence. And on one outcome in particular, it looks like kids in a certain kind of cohabiting household do a lot worse than kids in stable single-parent households. Okay, so what we see here is that kids in this type of cohabitation, right here, here, and here, are much more likely to be physically, sexually, and emotionally abused. And what kind of cohabitation do you think this is we're looking at on the screen? This is from a federal report, the 4th National Incidence Study of Child Abuse and Neglect. Exactly. So this is where you've got a bio parent right here and an unrelated adult cohabiting. And usually, of course, it's a mother with an unrelated male adult. Okay, so having an unrelated male in the household who's cohabiting increases pretty dramatically, as you can see here in this figure, the odds that a child will be abused in one way or another. Now, thankfully, this is still, for all these things, it's still comparatively rare, right? But again, the risks are much higher for kids who are living with a cohabiting, male who's not their biological dad. And what literally is the gold standard here in this particular figure? Not just married parents, but married biological parents here. Okay, so what we see, again, this is not my data. I didn't even color this data. This just comes right from the report. You can go online and look this thing up, and this is how they colored it. But it literally is the case that the gold standard here when it comes to safety for our children is the intact biological married family. Okay. So why is it that cohabitation is so risky for our kids? Well, I think the way to think about this is to sort of remember, again, for adults, cohabitation is appealing and attractive because it provides freedom and flexibility. Okay, freedom and flexibility. But the flip side of that, right, is that there's less commitment. There's less joint commitment for the couple. And therefore, there's less trust. There's less emotional security in that relationship. There's also then, therefore, more infidelity, and there's more domestic violence in cohabiting relationships, all of which, of course, are not great for children. And then I think probably one of the more fundamental points also in all of this is that there's more instability. And if you've had kids, if you have cared for children, if you have taught children, you know that children, particularly little kids, thrive on stable routines with stable caregivers. Okay? And that's not what cohabitation tends to deliver to children. So we can see here in some work done by some scholars at Michigan and Bowling Green that kids who are born to cohabiting parents are much more likely to see mom and dad part ways by age 5. compared to kids born to married parents. So again, there's less stability for cohabiting children here in the States. And this kind of instability, again, I think across the ideological spectrum for family scholars would be acknowledged as a big risk factor for kids. So there are plenty of folks on the left who do family scholarship who don't think marriage per se is all that important, but they would acknowledge that instability for kids is bad. And what I'm saying is, well, look, folks, there's a lot more instability for cohabiting relationships than there is for married ones when it comes to children in America. But I just said in America. And what we have also heard about this issue of cohabitation is that, well, yeah, in America, cohabitation is unstable. But in Europe, well, in Europe, things are different. So Andrew Trilland is probably one of the most eminent family scholars in the world, has written a book called The Marriage Go-Round. And in that book, he says that many cohabiting couples, it must be said, are capable of doing a very good job of raising children. In parts of Europe, such as Scandinavia and France, there are many long-term cohabiting parents who maintain families that are a little different from lasting marriages. But that's unusual in the United States, where cohabiting relationships are fragile and break up more often than marriages. So again, Trilland is articulating this idea that I've just talked about, that here in the US, cohabitation doesn't provide a real stable context for kids. But there's this thought that, well, in Europe, things are different. In a more progressive world with perhaps better welfare supports, places like France and Scandinavia, cohabitation isn't per se a problem or a challenge for kids. This view is also articulated by a colleague of mine who's a professional working for Accenture. I know him in the Charlottesville area, but he travels a lot to Europe. And he kind of put it this way. He says, people have moved on from looking at marriage as a sacred pact. He's talking about what he sees in Europe, in the UK, and the continent. You don't need this piece of paper to solidify your relationship. I don't see any difference between my cohabiting and married friends. I don't think people look at marriage as having that title that's going to keep them together. So this is a kind of a very common view that's articulated by professionals who kind of live and work and travel in Europe. So again, we're seeing that scholars and professionals think that Europe is different when it comes to cohabitation and stability. Are they correct? Well, no, they're not correct. So I've done some work with Laurie DeRose at Georgetown. What we find is that in France, for instance, you can see that kids who are born to cohabiting couples at all levels of education are more likely to see their parents split. In France, which was mentioned by Trilland as one of those countries where cohabitation's, more stable. And then what about Scandinavia? Well, again, in Norway, we see that at all levels of education, it's less stable than marriage for kids as they go through the life course up to age 12. And then in Italy, of course, in the south of Europe, it's the same story. Although what's interesting here is that Italians have actually, I think, probably the most stable families for their kids of any country in Europe. And in this big sample, they actually didn't see any parents get divorced, which is pretty striking by age 12. Whereas those in cohabiting families were more likely to break up. So the point that I'm making here is that even in Europe, we see that marriage is linked to a stability premium for families. And it's about, the case that kids who are born to cohabiting parents are about 96% more likely to see their parents break up compared to kids born to married parents. And again, this matters because kids who are being raised in stable two-parent homes are more likely to flourish. We know this from a lot of data in the US, but also data too from the United Kingdom and from across the continent. This is a scholar in Italy who's been studying these issues of family structure and family stability. And even in Sweden, where you have a much more generous welfare state, we see that instability, in this case single parenthood, is linked to more substance use and even suicide for girls and boys raised in single parent homes who experience some kind of instability typically. So that's why, in part, all of this matters. And then as we also look beyond just the US and beyond just even Europe, what we're seeing too is that cohabitation's on the rise in countries as different as, I just lost that, as different as Colombia, the Philippines, South Africa. So in other words, this is not just a thing about the United States or about Sweden. It's really a global thing that we're seeing across much of the globe. And again, even in these other countries, what we are typically seeing is that there's more instability in cohabiting households than in married households. And at the cross-sectional level, you can see this in this next slide here. So what this is showing us basically is that when you look, we got a sample of more than 60 countries around the globe, from Africa to Northern Europe, that as the percentage of kids who are born to cohabiting couples increases, what we see generally is that the share of kids who are living with both biological parents tends to decrease. Again, this is just sort of looking at this cross-sectionally. But then also when you look at kind of patterns in terms of when there's an increase in the share of kids born to cohabiting parents, when you kind of look at changes over time, we do see that on average, as the share of kids who are born to cohabiting parents increases, the share of kids who are living with biological parents tends to decrease. It's particularly the case in our findings when cohabitation is kind of just getting off of the ground, just becoming more and more common. You see the sort of intact two-parent family become less and less common for kids. So what this suggests to us is, as we think about the American experience and the experience of kids across much of the globe, and I'm quoting here from Ron Haskins at Brookings, Sarah McClanahan at Princeton, and Elizabeth Donahue at Princeton, that although it was once possible to believe that high rates of cohabitation and non-marital childbearing represent little more than lifestyle alternatives brought about by the freedom to pursue individual fulfillment, many analysts now believe that these individual choices can be damaging to the children who have no say in them and to the society that enables them. Again, so the point here is that I think cohabitation is seen as an attractive option because it gives people more freedom and flexibility, and they think prepares them well for marriage. But what people are not kind of bearing in mind is that sort of the rise of this particular option, this alternative to marriage, is creating a world where kids are more likely to be exposed to instability and a lot worse, judging from some of the outcomes we talked about earlier. So if we're interested, again, to kind of come back to the point I made about Arkansas and about the ACLU arguing against the state of Arkansas, that cohabitation in and of itself posed really no threat to the best interest of children. If we're really concerned about the interest of kids, and I would actually argue also welfare of adults, but particularly children, I think we have to sort of acknowledge that there really is no alternative to marriage when it comes to organizing family, because it's really marriage that's most likely, on average, to serve the best interests of children.